Welcome to the world's largest medicine galleries, home to over 3,000 amazing objects. Spanning centuries and continents. What you'll see is both extraordinary and familiar, globally significant and deeply personal, revealing our endless quest to better understand the human body. When you enter into the galleries, you'll be greeted by Self-Conscious Jean, a sculpture by Mark Quinn, inspired by the tattooed body of model Rick Genest. And it stands at the gateway of Medicine and Bodies, which explores how the search to understand more about the human body has transformed medicine, expanding our knowledge of the body from learning how post-mortems are conducted to ever closer observations, understanding the body on a microscopic scale, and revolutionary technologies such as the world's first MRI scanner that allowed us to examine the mysteries of the human body without resorting to surgery. And as you move through the gallery, you'll come face to face with a selection of historic objects collected by Henry Wellcome, like this medicine chest used by Captain Scott in the Antarctic, and marvel at some stranger things too. In this gallery, we examine the core purpose of medicine, treating people. From the ancient practice of trepanning skulls, to leech jars, blood transfusions in the trenches, and the UK's first robotic surgery. And no visit to the gallery can be complete without stepping inside this real Victorian pharmacy to learn more about poisons and how to make your own pills. In Medicine and Communities, we examine health challenges faced by groups of people and society, from deadly epidemics to the birth of the NHS, and how our behaviour can affect our health. This is a scale model showing what a state-of-the-art hospital would have looked like in the 1930s. The model toured the country where it was viewed by thousands. It contains tiny individual tiles, and the bed sheets are made of handkerchiefs that were donated by Queen Mary. In Faith, Hope and Fear, we examine the cultural side of medicine, the faith that we put in our treatment and in our doctors, and our hopes and fears about our own health. These are just a few of the objects and stories for you to enjoy in Medicine, the Wellcome Galleries, here at the Science Museum in London.
Good evening, I'm Clive Cookson, Science Editor at the Financial Times, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to tonight's event, part of a series to celebrate the Science Museum's spectacular medicine galleries, which you saw in that video. The museum says they're the largest medical galleries in the world, and I believe them. I hope you'll be able to visit the gallery when the museum reopens its doors to the public. When the museum does reopen, you'll find the galleries home to vials from the world's first BioNTech Pfizer and Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines administered, which you're seeing now on your screen, and they're part of the Science Museum's collection. Also pictured are the Medical Director of NHS England on the left, alongside Medicine's Gallery curator Natasha McEnroe, who you saw in the video. And we also, I think, are going to have a picture of Brian Pinker, yes, there he is, receiving the very first Oxford AstraZeneca vaccination. This event was originally meant to take place last March, but like so many events and plans over the last year, disruption caused by the pandemic means that it's happening tonight, almost a year later. But the subject of our discussion, vaccine hesitancy, and in particular the risk that poses to bringing about the end of the pandemic, has taken on even greater urgency. I'm going to be speaking with a number of experts shortly. Vaccine Deployment Minister Nadhim Zahawi, Doug Brown, Beate Kampmann, and Heidi Larson. I'll introduce them in a moment. We'll be taking some of the questions that you and the audience have submitted in advance. But to begin tonight's proceedings, I spoke earlier to the director of the US National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and chief medical advisor to President Joe Biden. He's become a household name over the past year and a voice of scientific sanity in a world that's often hard to make sense of. Dr. Tony Fauci. Thank you very much, Tony Fauci, for taking the time to talk to us. And thank you too for having been so generous over the years with your time communicating about infectious disease to the public. Now, before we move to the main theme of our discussion, which is vaccine hesitancy, I'd like to set the scene by asking you first whether we can vaccinate our way out of this pandemic, particularly given the way new variants of the virus are arising.
You know, the answer to your question is I believe that we can. I mean, obviously, variants are a challenge, but what we have learned most recently, for example, is that the variant that has been rather dominant in the UK, the 117 variant, is actually handled quite well by the vaccines that are currently being distributed in the United States, as well as those that will ultimately be used in the UK. That doesn't mean that every variant is going to be able to be handled. For example, the South African variant, the 351, there is about a five-fold diminution in the efficacy of the vaccines, even though they still fall within the cutoff of being effective. It's diminished somewhat. I think what we will have to do is to be very vigilant, particularly by expanding. And the UK does this very well. We in the United States are playing a bit of a catch-up on that in doing rather extensive genomic surveillance of the strains and isolates that are actually circulating. If you get a good handle on that and you're able to modify your vaccines where appropriate, I believe that if we get a good global response with vaccinations, we will be able to end this pandemic as we know it.
Thank you. That's a reassuring start to our discussion. Now, as time goes on, we'll inevitably hear reports of some people suffering side effects from vaccination. Indeed, there have already been a few. And what may seem large numbers of side effects are actually an incredibly small percentage of the vaccines actually given globally. Are you worried about those who hold anti-vax views trying to jump on these side effect stories?
Oh, without a doubt, it's concerning to me because when you have people who are adamantly anti-vax, if you look at the data as we know it, it argues strongly in favor of the benefit overwhelmingly outweighs the risks of vaccination with regard to both the reactogenicity, which I think people sometimes get confused between reactogenicity and adverse side effects. Reactogenicity is something that is anticipated, namely, it's the sore arm that you get with most vaccines, a little bit of an ache in the arm. When you have a prime boost, for example, what we're experiencing with the Moderna and the Pfizer after the second dose, a fair number of people wind up getting fatigue, some muscle aches, some actually wind up getting fever, so it can be uncomfortable. Those are anticipated and they're seen with many vaccines. Adverse events like some of the anaphylactic reactions that have been seen in association with the mRNA vaccines are things that do occur very rarely. And you're absolutely right. If you pick out the ones that occur and you focus on them, you might get the general population to believe that this is something common, when in reality, for example, the anaphylactic reactions are anywhere from 2 to 6 per million. And they really are very, very rare. But you're absolutely correct that whenever there's any type of an adverse event, the people who are adamantly anti-vaxxers jump on that and use that as an example for yet another reason why not to get vaccinated.
Now, last year, there was a modeling paper published in Nature looking at the online battle between pro and anti-vaccine views, and it concluded, I'm quoting here, our framework reproduces the recent explosive growth in anti-vaccination views, and it predicts that these views will dominate within a decade. So how big a problem, Tony, do you think the role of social media in anti-vax radicalization is, and how do we tackle that?
Well, I can answer your first question easily, but I don't have an easy answer to how we tackle it. You're absolutely correct. I mean, the internet and social media is an excellent way of spreading good information when the information is good, but it certainly amplifies false information and information that's misleading. And I think that the paper you're referring to in Nature shows the exponential expansion of these types of misinformation and disinformation. And I really don't have any easy solution to how we get around that, because it is kind of like a self-amplifying problem that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And people who have certain fixed thoughts and fixed opinions about something as significant as vaccines to take or not to take and the hesitancy, they can cause an extraordinary amount of difficulty by amplifying that on the social media and on the internet.
And you have the issue of whether you should be suppressing free speech on this issue. I mean, it's similar to a lot of political extremist issues on social media, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, people struggle with that. I mean, information that clearly is incorrect. There's always the reluctance to pull that or to block it because of the issue that that might be a slippery slope in trying to block information from people that might not be, destructive, as it were, to the public health. But I don't know what to do about that except to say that it is really quite concerning. Right now, the situation that we're faced with in the United States, and the UK is in the same boat as we are, is that we know that when we get a certain percentage of the population vaccinated, we get to what's called herd immunity, which means that the blanket of protection that is over society by the overwhelming majority of people getting vaccinated is something we know works very well for diseases like measles and polio and things like that. The situation we have right now, if we have a substantial proportion of the population does not want to get vaccinated, that would be a hindrance to our reaching that goal of herd immunity, which would be terrible because that would mean we would have a lingering of infections that we never would be able to completely suppress. So that's one of the reasons why it's so troubling to me when we're talking about vaccine hesitancy that's really having an impact on our public health goals.
Now, I don't know how much you're prepared to get into politics, but I can ask anyway. Does the previous US administration bear any responsibility towards contributing to misinformation about COVID and vaccines?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously, there were mixed signals that were coming out, mostly with regard to what to do to avoid infection, mask wearing versus not. One of the really difficult situations we faced in the United States is that we were going through, as you all were in the UK, going through a very, very difficult time, as we still are going through a difficult time. And you really would like to see a uniformity of message. But in the United States, we have had then, and still to some extent have now, a considerable degree of divisiveness in which public health measures took on a political overtone. Namely, that if you wore a mask or did not wear a mask, or if you went to a crowded place and congregate settings and bars and things, it was a statement that had some political connotations to it, which really is unfortunate, because when you're dealing with a public health measure, there's no room for divisiveness. Everyone is in it together. So your question about has there been difficulty because of the divisiveness in the United States, I would say definitely yes, unfortunately.
I'd like to ask next about a difference between the UK and the US, because as you know, the UK has decided to opt for a front-loading first vaccine injections in an effort to get people, as many people as possible, protected as fast as possible. Was that option discussed for the US? And do you agree, when we come round to vaccine hesitancy, that the UK's approach is arguably riskier and could undermine public confidence in vaccines?
Well, I want to make sure I word this carefully, because I have so many friends and colleagues in the UK. I certainly don't want to have my long-term friends be a little bit upset with me. But in all honesty and fairness, you're dealing with two different situations, because the major vaccine that you're discussing in the UK is the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which is the chimp adeno. And the studies that were done there with one dose versus two dose and the duration between the first and the second dose had the UK scientists come to the conclusion that, all other things being equal, that they would get the best bang out of the buck, as it were, if you want to call it that, by getting people, as many people vaccinated, and increasing the duration between a primary and secondary dose, or even not giving the secondary and relying on the primary. In the United States, we were focusing on a different vaccine, what's called a different platform. We have two vaccines that are being distributed currently in the United States, the Moderna and the Pfizer mRNA vaccine. Soon, likely within the next few weeks, we're going to wind up getting another vaccine in the mix, and that's the Janssen vaccine, which is a human adeno vector. So we feel, based on the science of a 30,000 and 44,000 clinical trial with the mRNA vaccines, that the science tells us the best thing to do is to give a prime. And if it's Pfizer, 21 days later; if it's Moderna, 28 days later, give the boost. That's the optimal way to get protection. Other variations of that with other platforms, I think, will depend on the data that's been accumulated. And the people in the UK have come to the conclusion that, based on their platform and their data, that that's the best thing to do.
I'd like to ask one or two questions that have been sent in advance by people who are in our audience for the event. So Joanna in London asks, do you think that vaccine mistrust stems from a lack of basic biology, knowledge of biology in the general population about how vaccines work? Or is it more of a cultural shift towards a lack of distrust of experts? And if so, how did that happen?
Well, that's a really great question. And I think that the question hit the nail on the head. It's both. I think a lack of science sophistication in understanding biology and the implications of biology are very, very clear. But it is also an anti-authority, don't tell us what to do kind of attitude, where the government, being a symbol of authority, is telling people you should get vaccinated, and people who push back from authority. And I think that there's a certain kind of a kindred spirit between the UK and the United States. We were once a colony of yours. That, in fact, there's the same spirit. There is that independent spirit of not being wanting to be told what to do. And if you combine that with a lack of an appreciation of some of the biological implications, it's understandable how so many people would really want to push back on vaccines.
I'm going to ask you now a more personal question from Rebecca, who's a practicing GP, a family doctor, and she says she's encountering this problem on the ground. What practical advice do you have on how our physicians, doctors might encourage uptake of COVID vaccination? And similarly, there's another question from Jessica, which simply says, how do I convince my husband that the vaccine is safe?
Well, first of all, I think you need to figure out what reason why people have hesitancy and try in a logical way to counter that without being accusatory. I found that when you push back when people don't want to get vaccinated and essentially make it an adversarial discussion, that never works. You'll never convince anybody to do that. But when you say, like, for example, Jessica trying to convince her husband that it's safe, it's simply look at the data. Take a look at the data. For example, in the United States, and I'll speak just from my own experience, we have 2 vaccines that are now being distributed in our population. The Moderna had a 30,000 person clinical trial, and the Pfizer had a 44,000 person clinical trial. And the safety profile is really quite clear that these are very safe vaccines, as are essentially all the vaccines that get approved by the regulatory authorities, either in the United States or in the UK. And that Jessica's husband needs to understand that the regulatory authorities would not let a vaccine out to the general public if it were not safe. And you have people who very, very clearly scrutinize that to make sure that you don't put the public at risk. And with regard to Rebecca, who's a physician and wanting to know how to approach her patients, I would recommend do the same thing, is to try and unpack or decipher out what the reasons for the hesitancy are and address it one by one in a logical fashion. It's not going to work all the time, but I have found that many times it does work and you can convince people.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Lastly, I'm going to ask a broad forward-looking question. Many people think that COVID is a dress rehearsal for an even bigger disease X pandemic to come. How can we set up so that we can vaccinate our way out of that one?
Well, I think one of the great success stories of the current outbreak of COVID-19 is how rapidly the scientific advances that have accumulated over the last decade or more allowed us to do something that would have been unprecedented just a few years ago, to go from the sequence of the virus being known on January 10th to actually having vaccines being put into the arms of individuals in less than 1 year, in 11 months to be exact, in December, both in the UK and in the United States, is a testimony to how important investments in science are to prepare you for the next outbreak. I mean, you have to have public health infrastructure to be sure, but the scientific advances, particularly in vaccine platform technology, have really been an extraordinary boon to us to be able to respond to COVID-19. And I think for the next outbreak, and there will be a next outbreak to be sure, that I think those continuing investments in public health infrastructure as well as science is going to get us through it.
Thank you, Tony. You've given us a tremendous start to our Science Museum event, a reassuring start. Thanks very much indeed. It's been a real
My pleasure.
pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, huge thanks to Dr. Anthony Fauci for setting out the science. Now let's move on to tonight's panel discussion. I'm really pleased to have our four excellent speakers with me tonight. In no particular order, they are Beate Kampmann. She's Professor of Pediatric Infection, Immunity and International Child Health, and also Director of the Vaccine Centre at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Next, we have Heidi Larson, Professor of Anthropology, Risk and Decision Science, and also founding director of the Vaccine Confidence Project, also at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Heidi's author of a book published last September, Stuck, How Vaccine Rumours Start and Why They Don't Go Away. Do read it, it's great. And we have Nadhim Zahawi MP, Minister for COVID vaccine deployment. And we're very grateful to you for taking the time to join us. I saw you in action this morning at the Common Science and Technology Committee. Last and not least, we have the Chief Executive of the British Society for Immunology, Dr. Doug Brown. Good evening to you all and welcome. I'm going to start with a short conversation or mini interview with each panelist before we open up to a wider discussion. And Doug, you're the first on. Let's start, if that's all right, with the basics, an overview for our audience of what exactly a vaccine is and why vaccines are one of the world's great global health achievements. So people generally have a general idea of what a vaccine is, but many won't know their long history. And for people who don't, when and how were vaccines first developed? Briefly, please, because I know it's a long history going back centuries.
It sure is. And good evening, Clive, and good evening, everybody else. It is a long and it's a really interesting history as well. And the UK has really been at the centre of this for many centuries. We know from a report that the British Society for Immunology published last year that the UK really leads the world in terms of immunology research. We have the greatest impact from immunology research of all G7 countries. And that really has been around for centuries. And thinking about vaccination, it started in the 18th century with a chap called Edward Jenner in 1796, who decided to try and develop a vaccine against smallpox that was killing millions of people. So he found a dairymaid who had caught cowpox, picked a pock off her skin, scratched the arm of a willing, in inverted commas, participant who was the 8-year-old son of his gardener, rubbed the pock in the scratch and gave him cowpox disease, and he was a little bit ill. And then about 3 weeks later, deliberately infected him with smallpox, and to everybody's relief, found out that the boy was immune to smallpox. So ergo, we had the first documented case of vaccination that happened here in Gloucestershire in the UK. Now, you'll be pleased to know that we've come on in how we do clinical trials, identify participants, and how we administer vaccines. That innovation really carried on through the 19th, 20th century to a point now where we have over 20 vaccine preventable diseases, which is really quite remarkable.
And another big question with a short answer, please. How broadly do they work, and what happens inside the body when you get a jab?
So yeah, I mean, really, from our perspective, vaccines are one of medicine's miracles, working on, and we're a bit biased, one of the most amazing systems in the body, the immune system. So in a nutshell, how a vaccine works is by training our immune system to recognize a virus or bacteria by delivering a harmless part of that virus and bacteria in the form of a vaccination. And once that harmless part of the virus and bacteria is in our bodies, it triggers our immune system to respond to that broadly, looking at, and many people will be aware of this terminology because of the pandemic, at activating two parts of our immune system. One is the B cells compartment that makes antibodies, and the other is the T cell compartment, which helps the B cell compartment, but also has a role to play in killing cells that are infected with virus and bacteria. So a vaccination kind of gives a whiff of the virus, of the bacteria, which means then when we see the virus and bacteria in real form, our immune system is trained to it, and it can act faster, it can act stronger to stop that infection in its tracks so we don't get infected.
And how much difference is there between getting immunity to a disease, because you've actually caught the disease naturally out in the real world from another person, and the immunity you get from vaccination? And is one more effective than the other?
It's a really good question, that. And first and foremost, the best way to get immunity to a preventable disease is through vaccination, without a doubt. Because I mean, essentially, you get the immunity without getting the disease itself. So we know for some of those vaccine preventable diseases, actually, we get a better immune response through vaccination. And the reverse is true as well, with natural infection sometimes inducing a bigger immune response. But all things considered, and we don't know what the case is with COVID at the moment. That's something we absolutely need to look into to optimize our vaccines. But always, it's better to get immunity through vaccination because we don't have to suffer the disease ourselves.
Well, we're going to take audience questions throughout the evening, and I'll start with one from Ruth, which is really another unknown, but I'll put it to you. She wants to know, on the available evidence, do the first generation COVID vaccines stop someone getting infected as well as reducing symptoms? What's your view of the evidence on that?
A really good question, Ruth, and thank you for that question. Well, the jury is out at the moment as to whether these vaccines have an effect on virus transmission. There's some early positive signs, but we really need to understand in some detail whether and what level of impact these vaccines might have on transmission. But absolutely, the primary aim of these vaccinations for COVID are to stop people getting ill, to reduce hospitalizations, and to save lives. And very nicely, actually, earlier this week, there was some data from the real world released from Public Health England, but also Public Health Scotland. And looking in Scotland, it showed that after one dose of the vaccine, 4 weeks after getting that dose, there was a reduction in hospitalization of around 90% between the two vaccines that are being used in the UK, which is really reassuring. We've seen it in the trials, but to see this in the real world is incredibly reassuring that this is preventing hospitalizations due to COVID.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Doug. We'll come back to you a bit later, but after Tony Fauci, you've continued to set the scientific scene beautifully. We're going to move on now to our next panelist, our Minister for COVID Vaccine Development, Nadhim Zahawi MP. Thanks again for taking the time to join us at the end of a long, long day. Let me ask you first, before we get into hesitancy, how satisfied are you with the way the vaccine rollout has gone to date?
It's been, in many ways, exemplary, because you prepare for these things and you strategize and you attempt to do mini pilots. But until you're into a real life deployment, the largest vaccination program in the history of the NHS, in the history of the United Kingdom, you're not quite sure whether your strategy put into practice actually will then deliver. And I think the NHS family, supported by our armed forces, of course, the army of volunteers, 80,000 volunteer vaccinators, 200,000 volunteers to be marshals and to help those top 4 most vulnerable categories in the 9 categories in phase 1 that the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation gave us to help them get that first dose protection has been wonderful. We rolled out in hospital hubs on the 8th of December with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for a couple of days to make sure that The protocols are all followed correctly, and to observe the safety of the vaccine, as CMO Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, quite rightly advised. We then rolled out that week into primary care. So 5 or 6 primary care GP practices would come together, decide who would lead, and then the rest would support, into hundreds of them in the first week, thousands and thousands now. Did the same thing with AstraZeneca Oxford on the 4th of January. And then, of course, opened up many national vaccination centres and community pharmacies as well. So the deployment infrastructure we've built can deploy even greater doses, which you will see now over the next 10 or 11 weeks, because we have to double the rate of vaccination than the first sprint, as I describe it, which got us to the middle of February, where we offered the vaccine to the top 4 most vulnerable cohorts and those who look after them, the frontline healthcare and those who look after the elderly in resident homes. Now we're into the next sprint, which is to offer the vaccine to all 9 categories, which is 32 million people by the middle of April, and then ultimately offer the vaccine to all the adult population by the end of July. And I'm confident both in the vaccine supply, and we can talk more about the manufacturing process. I'm a chemical engineer by background, not a vaccine manufacturer, but nevertheless, in any manufacturing process, there are always challenges to begin with. You get lumpiness, but then it stabilizes. One is a chemical, which is the messenger RNA vaccine by BioNTech Pfizer, and one is a biological compound, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. But I have very good line of sight in terms of the batches coming through. So I'm confident we'll meet our targets. But it's been an extraordinary coming together of what I think is the greatest strength of the United Kingdom. The pandemic has challenged many liberal democracies around the world. We just heard from Anthony Fauci about the challenges in the United States. I do think the one thing we are good at in the United Kingdom is organization and deployment. We demonstrated it in the Olympics in 2012, and I think the coming together of the whole country with the NHS family, the armed forces, the volunteers, the private sector, the back-end distribution is Boots and Superdrug distribution arms, and the front-end distribution to the GPs is DHL. And so it's a combination of all the great institutions in many ways, the armed forces and the NHS and the volunteers, that has made it possible to vaccinate 18.2 million people with the first dose as of yesterday.
The theme of this evening, as you know, is vaccine hesitancy. What evidence is there for the number of people who are being offered the vaccine and are choosing not to take up the offer?
So
do you have any figures for that?
Ethnicity breakdown and of course cohorts, Jason immunization amongst the at
sorry.
For
Sorry, Minister. I think we're slightly losing your. Do you mind? What we'll do. Sorry, Minister. We've temporarily sort of lost a clear feed. We'll move on to Beate, and then we'll come back to you if that's all right when we sorted out that. I'm sorry. We'll reset it and come back. So I'm going to Beate talk to you, and then we'll come back to Nadhim, I hope. So Beate, first of all, how do we know that vaccines are safe? And what do we know about possible side effects or adverse reactions, particularly to the COVID vaccines?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for inviting me to comment on what is really one of the most important aspects of any vaccine development, which is the safety of the product. Without a safety record, no vaccine can be approved and no vaccine will be given. So the safety is established in the clinical trials that are done prior to any vaccine getting approval or licensure. And it's done in a staggered sort of, stepwise way. First of all, a few people get the vaccine, then you increase the number of people. And by the end of it, for the COVID vaccines, as was already mentioned, you have 30,000, 40,000 people in a trial. And the one and only thing you will always look at is safety. And the safety can be divided in a little way in sort of, local reactions, which are not really a safety concern. They're more a byproduct by the fact that our immune system is interacting with the vaccine, like a swollen arm or a red arm at the injection site, or a little bit of fever, a headache the next day. So that's really to be expected, and it's not an adverse reaction. Adverse reactions are really, really rare. So with the COVID vaccines, we've already seen, after millions and millions of doses have now been given, there are very, very few of those. I think the ratio was something like 2 or 3 or up to 6 per million people who've been injected. So that's an excellent safety record already. What people are also concerned about is longer term safety. And again, the majority of any safety events in vaccinations occur around the time of vaccination and within the first couple of weeks. And it's really very rare to have any long-term adverse reactions, and those need to be proven to be related to the vaccine. And that's sometimes not that easy.
Some people have expressed concern, at least to people making opinion polls, about the breakneck speed with which these COVID vaccines have been developed, with everything happening as fast as possible in parallel. Do you think that it has been a safe process? Do you have any doubts about the super rapid research development process and the new technologies used?
Sure. I mean, I have absolutely no doubt that the same standards have been employed to the development of the COVID vaccines and it would have been employed to any other vaccine. And the reason why we've been able to pull things through, really, as you say, at breakneck speed, is because people who are involved in the vaccine development process have all sat around the table from the word go. And I think we somehow owe it to the Ebola epidemic, actually, that people have been so much quicker off the mark than we were with many, many other vaccines. It involved regulators, it involved academia, it involved industry, and very, very importantly, a lot of money was put on the table. It was all hands on deck. And the phases for the vaccine trials were pushed together a little bit, but the numbers of individuals that have been involved in these trials is very similar to what would happen in any other vaccine development. So therefore, I don't think any corners have been cut. The corners have just been rounded off by people pulling all in the same direction.
Do you think the process has been transparent enough to reassure the public? Because people have been following this more closely than any other vaccine development effort in history, with the possible exception of polio vaccines in the 1950s. What do you think of the industry's openness on the way the results of being put across, for example?
Yeah, it's actually not down to the industry. It's down to the regulators. And it's not industry that decides whether a vaccine sees the light of day. It is for industry and for academia, etc., to develop the vaccine to a level where data can be put to the regulatory authorities in various countries, like in the UK, it's the MHRA, in the US, it's the FDA, and it's for the independent judges to take that forward. And the dossiers will be examined not by the industry themselves, but by the people who have the ultimate responsibility for making sure that we do have safe and effective vaccines, and they are independent from industry. And I think that's really important for people to understand. And the whole process of what happens between, designing a vaccine from the genome to the bit where you do the clinical trials and then to the regulators and even beyond what happens in surveillance of vaccines is something that, all of a sudden everybody's really interested in. And for someone who works in vaccines all the time, this has been a great year to make that process really understandable through, animations and talks and Q's and A's. And I think that's what we need to do, because it's not everybody's subject.
I'm going to take another question from someone in the audience at this point. Sarah Duardi from Wimbledon's asking about one of the new technologies. If mRNA vaccines have never been used in humans before, how can you be sure that there aren't any long-term harmful effects that may not show up in clinical trials?
I think it's a really important question. And, obviously we don't have crystal balls and we can't predict that there's never going to be some effect that we haven't thought about. But the first way you look at it is you really need to think, is there a biological principle or a biological plausibility? And I've heard a lot of stuff around, these vaccines, they might insert themselves into the genome, for example. Now, mRNA can't revert into DNA and it can't go back into nuclei of cells. Therefore, there's absolutely no biological plausibility why there should be any effect like that. We've used RNA technology in cancer vaccines already, but it is completely right that we have never used them in this way of preventing infectious diseases. And the task is also there for regulators and surveillance organizations in the various countries to make absolutely certain. And that's why we have schemes in place that will follow anyone who's had the vaccine for a long time and pick up side effects that we might not even have thought about in a system that's called, in the UK, is called the yellow card system, where people can report if anything strange has happened to them, and physicians can report, the public can report, and then there is an investigation committee that can actually check whether what has been shown is at all plausible to have been related to the vaccine or not. And therefore, that's the way we can gather that data, and that surveillance is really important.
Thank you very much, Beate. We have been having a few technical problems, as you've probably noticed this evening, but I'm hoping we can now talk to Heidi. Perhaps, Heidi, you could tell us first about the Vaccine Confidence Project that you're directing, why it was set up and what the aims are. Oops. Sorry, we're not hearing you at the moment. I think
is that better?
We can hear you now. Yes, suddenly
Okay,
we can hear you.
Great.
Tell us about the Vaccine Confidence Project. I've got no confidence in this technology that we're using tonight, but I have great confidence that when you can hear us, you'll be able to answer the question. So please.
Thanks. The Vaccine Confidence Project, I actually founded 11 years ago now, having seen in the decade before, in my role at UNICEF, overseeing global communications and strategy for introducing new vaccines, that there was this growing epidemic of, it was individuals and some groups and even some individuals in government that had a growing number of questions about the amount, the type, the whatever of vaccine. So, and I started to try to bring attention to this issue, and everybody wanted to know, well, how big is this? I mean, is it really big enough to be distracting us from getting vaccines out? And I realized the only way that it would get some attention or be able to, react to it or respond to it is to start to measure it. And it was a bit of a messy emotional space, and nobody really had any measure for it. So I set out to start to define some metrics. And I have a diverse group from modelers, statisticians, social media analysts, epidemiology, psychology, anthropology. And we basically set our task to start to get a benchmark with the Vaccine Confidence Index that we defined, and also at the same time be doing social media analytics, qualitative research to understand why we have ups and downs in confidence. And we've been doing this globally since then.
Tell us what you're finding then in the way of differences around the world. Are you finding some misinformation spreading globally right around the world and some sort of localized national or regional rumors and theories? How does it all mesh together around the world, and where are the problems greatest?
Well, the problems are greatest where there's no trust in government, because at the end of the day, if there's one theme that we have found to be one of the strongest predictors of people's confidence and willingness to take a vaccine, it has to do with their relationship with government. I mean, when you think about it, the vaccines, they're procured by government, they're regulated by government, they're sometimes required by government. So if you have any kind of issue or distress or anxiety about government, it seems to play itself out on vaccines, which makes the confidence levels so highly varied around the world. One of the other things we've seen in the last decade is that vaccine confidence has become highly volatile. I mean, 10, certainly 20 years ago, it was much more stable. You kind of knew which groups, for whatever belief-based or other reasons, you might have a bit more of a challenge to get them to take vaccines. That landscape has totally changed. It's also become more polarized. Our index looks at strongly agree to disagree on issues around the importance, safety, effectiveness of vaccines, and beliefs. And people are moving to the strongly ends of the spectrum, which is concerning because it means that it's harder, particularly for the strongly disagree, to bring them back in to the acceptance area.
The figures I've seen show that confidence in the UK is pretty high by global standards. Is that the right feeling I have?
It's about the same as the US, actually, and it's pretty much in the middle of our global spectrum. The high end, we have Uganda, Rwanda, India, Ethiopia is quite strong. And then we have Europe. Well, Europe is more, in general, Europe is at the more skeptical end. When you compare to Europe, the UK is definitely the most positive, most confident in our European monitoring, which we're doing actually quite regularly with the European Union.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Heidi. I think we've got a good connection back with the minister. Sorry we lost you earlier, Nadhim. I was asking you when we did lose you about vaccine confidence or its opposite in the UK and what sort of signals you're getting. Have you got any sort of figures you can give us or any indicators?
Absolutely. I think just following on from that, the ONS survey recently showed that something like 85% of adults in the UK are likely or very likely to take the vaccine. I think Ipsos Mori had a survey last week showing us 89%, which is very high. That's really good news. But of course, the 15% or 11%, depending on which survey, who are vaccine hesitant, skew towards the Black and Afro-Caribbean community and BAME communities. And we are spending resources, but as well as thinking time to make sure we get this right. I published our uptake strategy on the 13th of February, which looks at obviously data and making sure that we are collecting ethnicity data and then sharing it with local government, because local government really does know its communities well, as well as that sharing best practice, i.e. who's doing well, how they're doing it, how can we share that at the company. One of the most interesting pieces of evidence is actually access. So not only the trusted voice that they want to hear from, which is a medical practitioner, doctor, GP, nurse, from the and different communities have different hesitancy, different questions around the vaccine, but also access to the vaccine at a convenient time and place. So we're looking at pop-up vaccine sites in mosques, in the Abbas Mosque in Birmingham, in East London Mosque, in the Hikmah Centre in Batley, in cathedrals across the board. We're looking at ways of making it accessible as well as sharing information. We've translated all the information into 20 languages, in Arabic and Farsi and Hindu and Polish, so that we share as much information as possible. We are, I think, beginning to make a real difference, because actually, if you look at this vaccination program compared to, say, the flu vaccination program, we've already far exceeded those numbers. So the modeling we had done at the NHS was looking at about 75% uptake. In the top 4 cohorts, if you look at the over 80s, that's well over 90%. Over 5s, I think it's almost 96%. Over the 70s, the same thing. But we nevertheless are not complacent. We continue to drive hard the messaging, make it accessible at a time and place where people can actually have the vaccine given to them, and that the messaging that it is very important for them to think about not just their own safety. And as we see more data on transmission, it's early days, but the Oxford team had some very good data on reducing transmission by 2/3. It has to be peer reviewed, of course, and we're waiting for some more data from Public Health England. But the data that Doug spoke about, Public Health Scotland and the universities in Scotland published yesterday, is very promising. So I think it's a combination of the uptake strategy and keeping focused on that, and communication.
One last question before I move back to the others and we open up the discussion. Are you worried that when we move to younger people, they will also become more hesitant? Because the uptake figures amongst the elderly have been excellent, but there's a fear that when you get down to younger people who maybe feel that they have less personally to lose from getting the disease wrongly, how will you get young people to take up the offer?
Well, again, I think as we get more data points on transmission and impact of the vaccination program on transmission, then the message will be, not only is it good for you because it keeps you safe from having serious infection and hospitalization, which we're already seeing some good data on, but also for your community, for your family, and for your friends as well. So I think it's that messaging delivered from trusted sources, trusted access to the vaccine that is convenient. At the moment, 98% of the country are within 10 miles radius of patients. To go even further as we get more volumes of doses into the deployment, to make it much more accessible by using the pharmacy network. We are at 200 pharmacies delivering the vaccination program. We're about to double that as part of our reaching our targets for mid-April and end of July. I think we can go even further, make it as convenient as possible. And communities are at knowing their community, trusted their community, and will reach those people who really want to reach, protect with the vaccine.
Good. Thank you very much, Nadhim. I want to pick up with some common misconceptions about vaccines, either misconceptions or deliberate misinformation. One is that vaccines can infect me or my child with the disease that they're trying to prevent. Doug, can you take that one on?
Yes, I can, and you know, a fairly straightforward answer is no, it can't. And so, as earlier, vaccines are harmless forms of the virus or the bacteria, so you don't get the disease. It's just to train your immune system to be ready for if you see the full virus and bacteria to neutralize it, stop it in its tracks, so that people don't get disease. So no, you will not be infected with the disease or your child through vaccination.
That's a simple answer. Thank you, Doug.
Yes.
Beate, what animal products, if any, are used in vaccines?
Yeah, good question. And it is a question, first of all, to understand what animal products are used in the manufacturing part of the vaccines, as opposed to what ends up being in the vaccine by the end. People might have different about either one or the other. There could be, you know, there are products that help, for example, cells to grow in culture that are really important for the manufacturing of the vaccine. And there could be gelatin or there could be enzymes being used during the manufacturing process. But that doesn't mean that those animal ingredients end up in the vaccine by the end of the day. So it's really important to figure out whether people are concerned about the products in general, or they're concerned about what ends up in the vaccine by the end of the day. And what ends up in the vaccine by the end of the day has to be declared in the package insert and in the, you know, the declaration of the ingredients in the vaccine. It's by law has to be very detailed and it's accessible. So everybody who wants can look up on the product information what products exactly, what bits are in the vaccine. Sometimes there's very, very small amounts of antibiotics in it, for example. Sometimes there could be some porcine ingredients. Sometimes there could be some other enzymatic bits in it. And it has to be declared. And often there's a religious perception that because of the presence of these products, the vaccine can't be taken up by a particular community. And what's really important is that then people with those concerns, especially when there are religious concerns, check with their religious leaders whether the vaccines are recommended. And companies are more and more attuned to those perceptions as well. And the ingredients are very clearly marked. And for example, with the COVID vaccines, there are no animal products in the vaccines that are currently approved. So that is very clear. And there was even a statement from the Islamic Association of the British Medical Doctors that these vaccines are highly recommended also for the Muslim community. So there are religious leaders which can help identify which ingredients in vaccines might or might not cause a concern, for example, animal products, or there was another issue with a very, very small percentage of alcohol. But compared to all the useful ingredients in vaccines, there might be very trivial amounts, but it's transparent. You can find out. It's not just put in there and nobody knows about it.
We've had a few questions about vaccines, in fact, many questions about vaccines and fertility. Many people are asking why vaccines are not going to be offered to pregnant women, and I think taking the wrong conclusions from that, asking about whether it'll affect long-term male or female fertility. Heidi, would you like to take that one on? And then I can pass it to the others,
Sure.
because it is an area of concern.
Yeah, I think the question around fertility and anxieties about sterilization or effects on fertility is probably one of the oldest anxieties in the book when it comes to vaccines. We've seen it in all corners of the world. And when you think of it, it's quite an existential concern, particularly if you're in a minority group or whatever, depending on the nature of your anxiety with the state. But there's also a very personal thing with in general, pregnant women have not been included in trials. And that also has provoked a perception that, you know, there must be a reason for that. And there is a reason for that because, you know, in trials, you start with healthy people and then you start moving to older or younger. And it's only more recently, and Beate, I work very closely with Beate on the broadening scope of maternal immunization, vaccination during pregnancy because we have newer vaccines coming. But it is a time where people are more anxious. But Beate, I think you should come in here. But yeah, it's certainly not because of fertility issues. It's because of the path of where the trials are going.
Beate, yes, please.
Maybe if I could just add to that. So the notion that the vaccines are not to be used in pregnant women is no longer correct. The vaccines are useful and could be used in pregnant women. There are recommendations that have varied a little bit, and that hasn't necessarily helped the matter. So in the US, for example, the vaccines were approved for use in pregnancy from the word go. Initially in the UK, that was not the case, but the UK recommendations have changed. And now it's a risk-benefit assessment for women who have other additional risk factors, for example, the known risk factors for severe COVID, or who are very exposed. And a lot of our healthcare workers are women of childbearing age, and it's really important to advise them properly. So this risk-benefit ratio needs to be considered. And the reason why it's not just, oh, well, let's just use them in pregnant women is because of the very issue that we raised before, that safety is absolutely paramount. And because the women weren't included in the trials, the pregnant women weren't included in the trials, we haven't got a safety database that is solid, that we can have the reassurance that we would love to have. So there's two ways we can go about it. One is to have safety pregnancy registers, which means that women who have taken the vaccine participate in a register and get followed up in the longer term. And the other is to start doing these trials in pregnant women. And this very week, one of those trials has actually started. And there are another two companies that are also going to test these vaccines in pregnant women. So this is really changing. And pregnant women should not be discouraged from taking the vaccine, but it depends on their overall risk of coming to severe harm from COVID, whether their obstetrician or primary healthcare physician might advise them to do so or not.
Nadhim, can I ask you, as the Vaccines Deployment Minister, what your advice is to pregnant women at the moment?
Yes, absolutely. And that is to discuss with your doctor whether you think you need to have the vaccination. That has been the advice in the United Kingdom, and I think the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tam, went into some detail all of today on, I think, every network, both this issue and, of course, on fertility, where it is clearly completely safe, and this anti-vax misinformation is something that we are making sure that we tackle through getting people like Jonathan Van Tam on screen, so people hear from clinicians, not politicians.
Okay, thank you. No, that's clear enough on those issues. I talked to Tony Fauci about the role of social media in promoting both good, positive information about vaccine and misinformation. Nadhim, where do you stand on the extent to which social media should be regulated or self-regulated on this particular issue?
So I want to thank the social media platforms, because we've been working with them since March last year. We have a cross-government unit which is in the Cabinet Office with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS, leading on this, which is the COVID misinformation, disinformation unit that picks up all this. I described it as a tsunami of disinformation, misinformation from different profile of anti-vaxxers and some malign states or individuals, and alerts the social media platforms to it down as quickly as they can. We want to see them do it rapidly, of course. We want them to continue to do this as we roll out the vaccination program. Let's not forget, we're only about a third of the way through this. We've had the first sprint. We're now in the middle of sprint 2, and then probably a marathon to get the whole of the adult population vaccinated by the end of July. And so a lot of work remains to be done, and we want to continue to work with them. The important thing is also to get into the communities. So we have a communities champion program, well resourced, about £25 million, identifying community leaders, faith leaders, that we can actually empower and give them the resources and the information to be able to take and debunk some of this stuff that's being circulating on text messaging and WhatsApp and other platforms. It's becoming quite sophisticated, and it is huge in volume. But the best way to deal with it is from hearing from people that you really trust in your community.
Heidi, I think you should pick up on the role of social media and what the ministers called the tsunami of misinformation.
I totally agree with the volume, the fact that it is a tsunami, but what makes it challenging when it comes to understanding what is disinformation, or the ones that are motivated to create havoc and undermine vaccination, to try to separate that from the misinformation that is genuinely people who don't know they're spreading misinformation, because there's a lot of uncertain information around, and they might think something is actually true and spread it on, not knowing that it's going to be amplified. And so that's where it gets complicated. But I do think that the other side of this landscape is that it's a cues to us as a public health community to be hearing the concerns of people, so that it can help inform, when you do work with, as we just heard, is very proactive, the work with community leaders, that it can help. And this is part of the role we play, have been with the government, is trying to sift through the scale of this and categorize it and try to understand what are some of the things that we need to address, that are fixable, because some of it is quite entrenched, but there's a lot of it that's actually useful for us to know what the concerns are, because it's not otherwise it's certainly not in the newspapers anymore. It's really gone into social media spaces. So that's where we can get our understanding of the concerns, at least part of them.
Right, I want to take some of the audience questions before we run out of time. I think this might be one for you, Nadhim, again, please. This is a question from Sandra in Hayfield, and she says, a number of care home workers looking after my father have refused the vaccine that was offered to them, even though care home residents like him are particularly at risk. Should there be a policy against this?
Thank you very much, Sandra. And I think the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, summed this up really well, as in, everyone who is in their work having to look after clinically vulnerable patients, whether in hospital or in a care home setting, professional responsibility to take the vaccine when it is offered to them. We're seeing the numbers begin to creep up in terms of those who work in care homes for the elderly. I think we're just over 70% now, 71%. But we need to go much further. And part of it is access, because people may not have been in the care home gone in to do the first dose vaccination. So we are now returning to those care homes again. We've got planned 4 visits in total, 2 visits for first dose, because some patient residents would have been infected with COVID. You have to wait 28 days and then return. So we will be making those return care homes now, and of course 2 more visits after that for second dose. So 4 visits in total. and we will see, I hope, those numbers begin to rise, and reach those high numbers that we saw with the other cohorts. But I do think professional responsibility for people who work with the most vulnerable people who are in danger of being infected and have a serious infection and hospitalization and death, to take that professional responsibility seriously. We're seeing some care home operators like Barchester actually declare that they want all employees to be vaccinated. Surgeons have to be vaccinated for hepatitis, and condition of employment for a very long time in the NHS. Obviously, at the moment, vaccines are not mandatory in the UK, but I do think those who are in settings where they're looking after the most vulnerable in our communities to COVID have a professional responsibility to take the vaccine.
Thank you. Question from, I think I'm going to put this one to Doug. Fiona McMahon asks, why does Big Pharma insist on vaccines and not cures? Is it only because of the profit that people's ill health gives them? That's the first really hostile question.
That's no, thank you for fielding that one to me, Clive. But no, genuinely, thank you for the question, because I mean, this is quite often fueling misinformation that is out there, and actually the pharmaceutical industry play a really key role in developing our medicines, our cures, and our vaccines for a whole host of diseases and conditions. And in the COVID effort, with this unprecedented coming together of the research community, particularly in the UK, immunologists, virologists, lots of people coming together, but working across the globe. A crucial part of that has been working in partnership with industry. And if we look at this particular pandemic, absolutely, prevention is better than cure. And so, given the scale of this pandemic, the number of people that are being infected, the approach that we do need to take is to develop a vaccine. But the pharmaceutical companies, just really to reiterate, they play a really important part in bringing these vaccines and medicines to us all, in partnership with many other parts of the R&D ecosystem.
Thank you. That was a good defense of the industry. Minister, can I put another one to you? So I think it's most appropriate. This is another issue that's bubbling under. How do you respond to those who plan on, this is, yes, from Dave, this is from Harvey in Derby, I should have said. How would you respond to those who plan on refusing to take the vaccine due to their belief that companies like Pfizer are immune from prosecution?
Thank you, Harvey, for your question. The ultimate responsibility for the vaccination program lies, of course, with us as the government, and of course, we have an independent regulator, Harvey, that looks at the vaccines. You've just heard from experts on this panel as to the regulatory framework that has to that vaccines have to go through, whether it's phase 1 trials, phase 2, and then phase 3 trials. And as you've heard earlier, no corners have been cut. It's simply the ability, rather than to do each trial sequentially, to parallel the trials, because enough resource, both financial but also in terms of the population. You heard from Anthony Fauci talk about the size of the trials, 30,000, 40,000 people trials. So these vaccines have gone through exactly the same procedure in terms of regulation as any other vaccine. The regulator is independent of government. They also keep the yellow card system that you heard about earlier, which records every adverse reaction, and they examine that and publish that data, which they've just done recently. And so I would very much recommend that you look at the both the MHRA report on why they effectively regulated and approved the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, and now Moderna as well, and look at the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization and the work they did looking at the vaccines. It's all there in the public domain. If you Google that, MHRA or JCVI or NHS or .gov.uk, you will see all that available to you. And so ultimately, this has been done in a really, really rigorous way. And we've now vaccinated 18.2 million people with the first dose. And you can have a look at the yellow card data that's just been published, I think, end of last week by the MHRA. So you can see for yourself the very, very small numbers. You heard that from Anthony Fauci and from other panelists today, compared with the number of people who've had the first dose of the vaccines.
Thank you very much. Heidi, the last two questions have indicated that some of the distrust of vaccines is linked with a distrust of the pharma industry. Are you finding that in the work that you're doing? And if there was more trust in the companies, would that help people to trust the vaccines?
I don't think, we haven't found that it's any one factor usually. And interestingly, the companies haven't been as criticized and I'm not speaking about the UK specifically here, but in general, governments get more the issue is with governments than with companies. It depends on the group. There are some people who are quite distrusting of companies, and it depends where you live and which company. In some of our surveys, we found that 65% of the people in our global study on COVID vaccine said that where the vaccine is manufactured would affect their willingness to accept it. And presumably that, is if they think it's credibly produced. There's sometimes more questions about who funds pharmaceutical companies, questioning the motives there. Some of the funders have taken more criticism, but I think it is a mix, and there are some people who don't trust the profit motives of companies. Others have issues with how they're regulated or not. But I would say there's no single actor that it's a mix of factors and usually, but they are one of the anxiety points for some people.
Just out of curiosity, have you managed to disentangle any of you why the sort of bizarre intertangling of opposition to 5G and COVID vaccines and Bill Gates? There are some weird conspiracy theories out there. I don't know if anyone wants to have a quick go at them. I mean, maybe not.
Well,
I mean, maybe they're just so
well,
bizarre.
it was, to put it in context, 4G, H1 was blamed on 4G and SARS was blamed on 3G. So some of it was, there is an anxiety about technology that some groups have. And I think, I can turn to others' views, but the anxiety about the chip, being a chip implanted through something Bill Gates is doing is part of the whole anxiety, I think, about feeling counted, which is a broader concern with some people about vaccination, is this feeling that they're being counted and monitored and followed. For those who have a conspiracy, conspiratorial tendency, I should say.
I'm going to have now, we've only got 5 more minutes. I'd like to ask each of you very quickly in a minute or so, please, to give us a final thought reflecting on what we've talked about this evening. Beate, would you like to start us off, please? Closing
Sure.
idea.
Yes. Well, I don't know if it's a closing idea, but the observation from this year has really been that without properly funded science, we would have never got to the space where we are now. And this is funding that also was absolutely crucial for universities. And to bring together the multidisciplinarity that is needed to pull something through from a genome sequence to a delivery system like we've seen. And, you know, I've been fortunate to participate in actually giving the vaccines in our own healthcare system as being the most positive event of the year, really. To bring all that together needs substantial support, and it also needs that trust that it can be done and it is the right thing to do. And we have to somehow manage to instill that trust into the people who are also the recipients and make them believe that it's not just their own health that matters, but also the health of others. And I would like to see that on a global scale as well, because we have talked very much today about the UK and maybe about the US, but we have not really talked much about that this is a pandemic. And the responsibility for each of us to cater to that global need, I think, is something that I would like to take forward in wherever we go with this.
Thank you. I'm so glad you paid testimony to the science and the need to fund it properly. Doug, obviously you'd agree with that. What would you like to say to close?
Yes, I absolutely agree with what Beate just said around research funding and the infrastructure that we have in place and also built over the last 12 months or so within the UK and globally that has allowed us to carry out research on a scale and in a collaborative way that just hasn't been possible previously, with sharing of samples, data, coming together of researchers. We really have, it's been absolutely unprecedented and developed our understanding and vaccines incredibly quickly. I think on that science front, we also need to make sure that we don't take our foot off the gas with that investment and with that focus, because we have several vaccines, but we need to stay ahead of this virus. We need to be prepared for any future pandemic that might happen. So we need that infrastructure. We need the understanding within the community to take it forwards. I think on a vaccine hesitancy perspective, I would agree with a lot of what's been said this evening. And I think it really boils down to that two-way conversation with the general public and as a whole, but also honing in on key communities that may have that distrust and may look to misinformation more regularly than other communities, so that we're having that conversation with everybody, but it's targeted and delivered in a way that works for those individual communities where we know confidence may not be so high. If we don't see a reasonable uptake, a good uptake of this vaccine, then we're not going to be seeing the use of these vaccines to get us out of this pandemic. So it's absolutely crucial we have that two-way conversation.
Thank you. Heidi?
I just want to say, I think this 2021 is probably one of the biggest years for vaccines in history so far. And we have an absolutely huge opportunity this year that we really need to embrace and remember every single moment. This year will be remembered. It'll be remembered if we get it wrong, and it'll be remembered even hopefully more that we get it right. And I don't think we'll ever, hopefully not, have such an opportunity for demonstrating the value of vaccines beyond personal health, beyond even group health. This is about getting, and it's tangible. We've had economists write about the economic value of vaccines, but that doesn't touch the hearts and minds of people. The value of vaccine at a broader societal level, getting people back to work, getting kids back to school, getting back with families, has never been so tangible as it is now. And somehow we have to capture that. We need to kind of take advantage of that to build the confidence in vaccines, because we can change the landscape on vaccine confidence more broadly if we do this right. And I think I'm hoping for the world that we kind of make even the most marginalized feel like they're cared about. And equity in vaccines doesn't mean equal time for all people. Some people are going to need more time, and we should make sure we take that time.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Nadhim, you have the last word.
Thank you very much. Well, we continue to deploy vaccines at pace, protect the most vulnerable as quickly as we can. Of course, make sure that we continue to collect data on the efficacy of the vaccines and of impact on transmission, as well as making sure that we keep a very close eye as we reopen the economy cautiously, the 4 weeks plus one that Chris Whitty spoke about, so that at each point, whether it's on the 8th of March or the 29th of March or in April or May or June, we leave enough time for us to see how the virus is reacting, to be able to rapidly test, trace, genomically sequence, and isolate in the way we're doing with the South African variant and with other variants like the Brazilian variant. And of course, keep an eye on those variants and future-proof our vaccination program back to investment in science and research by working with obviously the current teams that we have deploying the vaccines, but also looking at messenger RNA. We've just announced a deal with CureVac to use our genome sequencing capabilities in the UK so that we're ready to produce the next vaccine variant to deal with any virus variant in the future, maybe in the autumn with a boost and in future years as well. But also that technology itself and having the capability in the UK to further develop that technology, not just for COVID, but for other diseases, and manufacture in the UK is going to be vital, which is why we have to make that investment. And there's others, plant-based vaccines, very big opportunity for the United Kingdom in plant-based vaccines. And finally, no one is safe until the whole world is protected and safe, which is why from the inception of the Vaccines Task Force under Kate Bingham and now Clive Dix, the Prime Minister set two targets. One is to identify vaccine candidates and be able to produce some of them in the UK rapidly. But the other one is to really lean into COVAX and the WHO and last year's Gavi conference, which raised $8.8 billion. The G7 now, they've just raised another $4.3 billion on top of our £500 million, because we have to protect the low-income and middle-income countries. Because, yes, of course, we want to vaccinate our population and protect our people, but we have to do the same for the rest of the world and share both resources, vaccines, and knowledge with the rest of the world.
Thank you very much for those final thoughts from all four of you, with which I, as the neutral chair, totally agree. Brings the evening to a close. Huge thanks to our guests this evening, Minister Nadhim Zahawi, Professor Heidi Larson, Professor Beate Kampmann, and Dr. Doug Brown, and of course our guest earlier, Tony Fauci. And if you found this evening's discussion thought-provoking and interesting, you can find many more events on the Science Museum's website, including the next in the Science Museum Group's Climate Talks series. And the next one's going to be the day after tomorrow, Friday evening, chaired by John Snow. He's going to be asking with his panelists whether capitalism is compatible with environmentalism. And I think you'll find a link below on your screen to book a free ticket, as you did for tonight. And you'll also, on the same screen, be able to make a donation to the Science Museum Group. So that really does bring us to a close. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for the stimulating discussion, and goodbye to everyone. Good night.